all right. Of course, you're just trying to get ready for starting things.
Seems fine.
Busiest time of year. Nice to get away from it for an evening.
Wait.
Yeah,
this actually doesn't.
For almost 2 weeks.
No, that isn't right. That isn't right. Yeah.
I was teaching. I teach a course.
I must have sent you the wrong thing.
Oh my God.
And I was teaching that in a week of sort of 3 hours a night.
No, I have it. I have it.
So my daughter went with me, and I went to St. Petersburg for a few days, and then in the daytime, of course, Moscow, we could just go do whatever we liked as long as I was
going
going
to screen.
So it's a nice combination.
It wouldn't be on here. It would
It's
be
the end of their real summer.
Chris wants to change his.
Never been before.
So was it your first time?
Yeah, it was amazing.
Is it nice?
Yeah, it's
there's lots of historical stuff in there.
What you do?
I mean,
control.
I'm just going to copy them all.
Formal guides. It was a former master's student of mine that teaches there now and arranged for me to come, so he took us everywhere.
Start from there. Don't delete that from there.
In Colchester, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So just an hour and a bit away. It's pretty convenient, which is why I never stay over.
Yeah.
That's going to be nice. I'm going to find something new now.
I'm not going to. I didn't want the other ones because the other ones are actually important to Syria. I've got to kind of
turn it down.
keep it.
Although I saw
diplomatic.
All right, so saying. Okay, so all right, fine.
So let's
artistic competition.
Crisis over.
That's good that we
How did I?
do
Yeah.
Definitely the one you sent me was the one.
Yeah,
Jordanian
I'm sure.
born but
Sorry.
British.
So
Right,
I
Hamdan,
hope it's not on the
that
website.
does art about speech and nations and borders and barriers. I met him like 8 years ago.
I had a look on the website this morning. I
He's
could
one
see
of
the position papers.
one of the finalists in this
So
one.
you want to take that
I'd like
back?
to come in and see that as well.
That's interesting.
Let me just leave it in there for now in case of any weirdness.
It's always interesting when you talk to artists about the stuff we do because they have a completely different worldview about it.
Yeah.
They offer a bit of water to you.
How's your trip to Russia?
Yeah, it was great. I was just telling Mohammed I've never been there before, and it's really fascinating. So,
Cool. Where did you go?
I spent a week in Moscow teaching, and go back the next 2 Septembers and teach to the next classes. Of course, on language and human rights. I teach at Essex, but we also went to St. Petersburg for 4 days. My daughter went with me. Right. And she's in the middle of university, so it was really nice to travel with her. I have to convince my wife to go. She's a bit more skeptical and worried about going to Russia.
Yeah.
And in truth, they made it very hard for me to get a visa because I have a U.S. passport. So I failed to get one in June, and we had to cancel the course and try it again in September.
Oh wow. Do you feel like you were a bit intimidated as well?
Actually, all the people at the consulate and all were really helpful. They just said, we can't speed it up. We can't get it in time. Sorry.
So you're told to fill in the feedback forms?
Yeah. So I can say something at the end of my talk.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't come to your event in the spring. I was going to, it was just before, just after I went to Belfast for a couple of days, and I had to have unpleasant dental surgery. I was just feeling crap. Yeah. So I thought I can't sit in a seminar for the day, moaning and grabbing my jaw.
No worries.
So it's going to be Peter and not Chris. After you've done your talks, I'll give again everybody a chance to comment on other people. So I think maybe we could go Chris, Mohammed, Peter, got the comments. Is that
Meaning, I say a bunch of stuff.
You say your presentation, and then you can And in relation to
each other.
this, like I thought of this, or if you want to, you don't have to.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, but so you're organising the reaction in
Yes.
terms of who's doing reacting.
Yes, who's
So
in what order of
I'm
reactions?
reacting to these
yes,
guys. Then.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so then Peter finishes off that, and then I might have to kind of summarize what you have in common and how you are different for people who aren't necessarily language scientists.
That's interesting.
And the Q&A will be after the comments.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
We should finish by 7:30. And we're all going to the restaurant.
Good.
Right, Peter, you're coming to the restaurant with us.
I'm good. Ready to go.
But you're coming with us to the...
To the restaurant, yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
excellent.
sure.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Gianluca Parolin, and I'm the faculty lead on the governance program. I'm particularly happy tonight to start our series of events on governance and language at the program with this panel on LADO, Arabic LADO, or LADO in the UK. But by all means, take up one of the flyers because they have all the 3 events that are being offered this fall, and also the short course that will be offered in early November. So as you see, there's a theme this year that connects governance and language, and I think it's marvelous that we actually start with this panel on something that also touch very close to home in many respects. It is also on the back, you'll see also the governance theme, and we're very happy to have Dr. Nancy Hoker as our 2019 fellow. And so she will be chairing, she organized the event and she will be chairing it, and so many thanks to her for all the good effort. So I will just turn the floor to her, and welcome again, and enjoy the evening.
Hello. Tonight we have 3 speakers who have been working on language assessment for determination of origin with regards to Arabic for 2 of them, and in general for Peter Patrick. So Professor Peter Patrick is at the University of Essex, and he has been working on LADO for about more than 2 decades, I guess. Prior to that, he was working on Creole languages. So Peter is going to speak first, and then Dr. Mohammed Atiq, who is from Birkbeck University, will speak second, and then Dr. Chris Lucas from SOAS will speak third, and then there will be a discussion, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So could I ask Peter to start?
Thank you. I guess you can all see. I'm going to sort of turn this way so I can see you all at once as well. I'm going to talk about the pitfalls of LADO, language analysis for determination of origin in Arabic cases. This is a term, by the way, that my colleagues Diana Eads and Micah Phillips and I came up with about 8 or 9 years ago to describe this type of activity. So I'll tell you just a little bit about it, because I've spent many hours describing it in detail, and there isn't time for that tonight. And then I will, thank you, give an example of how it might or might not work, a very brief one. Talk a little bit about my involvement as a linguist, an academic linguist. And then from my perspective, I'll give you what I think are some of the chief problems and difficulties with LADO. And if there's time, I'll say something about who gets LADO tested and how are they selected. And mention a few issues affecting the use of LADO, especially in Arabic cases, of which there have been many more in recent years than there were a decade ago. And I'll also very briefly mention 3 important ideologies about language, folk beliefs about language, that affect all languages, but especially Arabic. And I'll conclude by talking a bit about the intersection of ideology and expertise, and ask the question, how much confidence should we have in the use of LADO analyses for Arabic speakers? So that's the roadmap, if you like. Can everybody hear me well? Thank you. Okay. LADO is a branch of applied linguistics. That is, it's linguistics applied to a problem that's not an academic problem initially. And it's used by governments when they're processing asylum seekers who are applying for refugee status. Applicants get evaluated by government agencies, branch of the Home Office in the UK, which are seeking to tell whether they speak the language of a group that they claim to belong to. And that's part of testing their general asylum claim to come from a certain nation and or a certain region within that nation, and sometimes a specific group or set of groups within that region. So what happens is that an interview takes place. In the UK, that interview is over the telephone with one of two Swedish for-profit firms. And then the speech recordings of the interview are analyzed by these firms in order to determine whether the way the asylum claimant speaks shows features of the particular language variety that their claimed group speaks. In other words, can they match up to what we know about the way a group speaks? So that's the basic process. Interestingly, LADO was not begun with linguists involved at all. Instead, it was interpreters for the Scandinavian government who were first involved, asked by the government not just to interpret for asylum seekers, but also to say whether they thought they spoke the way they ought to. So the issue of lacking adequate linguistic expertise, as opposed to interpreting expertise, was there from the very beginning in the early 1990s. Of course, interpreters are language experts, but they're not trained in comparative dialectology or sociolinguistics, which I am, just as I'm not trained in interpreting, right? So it's different types of language expertise related but separate. Where adequate linguistic knowledge and expertise is lacking in a process in general, please come in. What we find is that folk beliefs or ideologies about language come into play, and they regularly mislead the people who practice LADO and help to determine the outcomes of asylum cases. You might already guess how I feel about that. So, in my view, expert knowledge of linguistics is needed at all levels as inputs into processes of policy making regarding LADO, government commissioning of LADO tests in individual asylum cases, the performance of LADO tests by language agencies, and of course the government bureau evaluating those test results and making their decision about asylum cases. And finally, for asylum seekers who are rejected and who appeal the decision, expertise is required in legal determinations of the appeals as well. So, lay people imagine this process as a sort of linguistic passport. You open your mouth, and that tells listeners with certain skills what country you're from. And that's the sort of folk notion behind LADO. Of course, from a linguistic point of view, this is wrong, and I hope my colleagues are smiling as well. Linguists are simply not able to determine nationality from speech. It's not a linguistic category. The key questions for me that linguists can scientifically address are questions about language socialization, where a person was socialized into the use of language, especially their native language, if they have just one, and also speech community membership. Can they be matched up with a speech community about which linguists know things? So this is a sociolinguistic matter, again, from my perspective. Adequate LADO demands competent knowledge of linguistic issues and sociolinguistic issues, such as the production, the speaking of vernacular speech, the perception of vernacular speech, language attitudes and ideologies, the effects of context, social and historical, on speech variation at a minimum. And then many others also may come into play. So here's an example of the pitfalls of LADO. You've heard me talk for a couple of minutes now. Am I a native English speaker? Raise your hands if you think I am. Okay, fair enough. I'm a native English speaker. Where am I from? What? North America? Canada? USA? Any guesses? Canada? Hold up your hands. USA? British people are so polite. They often say Canada for Americans. Okay, I'm from the USA. East Coast? West Coast? North? South? Any guesses? Midwest, thank you. My wife is from the Midwest, so I know I'm not. Right. Does anybody here know or think you know what a New York City accent sounds like?
It's not used.
Okay. Have I got one?
No.
No, I don't have one. Well, that's true. But I was born in New York City. In fact, for the linguists here, I was born on the Lower East Side of New York City, the best place for a sociolinguist to be born. My parents were American. I spent my first 5 years in New York City. So, that's interesting. Does anybody know or think you know what a Jamaican accent sounds like? Okay. Have I got one?
No.
When I talk like this, clearly not. But if we go on chat de patois, uno would say, man, a Jamaican Creole in my talk now, you know. Okay. So I spent childhood years of age 5 to 15 in Jamaica. I had all my schooling there for 10 years. Spoke Jamaican Creole after I learned it, daily with my brothers and all my friends. So a LADO test would fail to assign me either to New York City, where I'm from by birth, or to Jamaica, where I'm from by childhood experience. So that might give you an inkling of some of the problems we have. Now, I'm a sociolinguist. I'm not an expert on Arabic, unlike my colleagues. I don't speak it. I don't study it, although I do work with students who study it. I've been involved in LADO since 2003 in efforts by academic linguists and also linguists in the professions to push government and commercial LADO analysts towards a level of basic adequacy in linguistic adequacy. And I have to say, for the most part, we're not there yet. In 2004, with 18 other people, I co-authored a very short set of guidelines designed to help governments. They're cited in thousands of cases per year. Every academic should be so lucky. I've filed over 100 reports as a linguistic expert in appeals in the UK asylum process. When asylum seekers are rejected, get a lawyer, and the lawyer contacts me. I've also been consulted in appeals cases, the England and Wales Court of Appeal, the Scottish Court of Session, and a case that went to the UK Supreme Court and actually was successful. For these, I get paid by legal aid. It's always advisable to say that you get paid for something you're advocating or arguing with. I've met with government bureaucrats from 8 European countries in this process. Of course, everything I'm talking about has been done with many other colleagues, right? It's not just me. I've also met with representatives of the leading commercial firms, the ones that work for the UK government and whose reports I listen to, read, and evaluate. And also with lawyers, with immigration judges, interpreters, and many other people involved in the asylum process. And I've also published research as an academic should. This book came out earlier this year, and the title of it is very easy to remember after this talk, LADO. Okay. So from my view, the main problems are a problem of oversight at the highest level, widespread lack of informed oversight, linguistically informed oversight, in policy making, procuring of providers, these commercial firms, review of how LADO is used, and in the actual use of it. Secondly, expertise, which for an academic is the sort of the most interesting and the thing that we get most excited about. There's a widespread lack of basic, adequate linguistic knowledge in the commissioning, the performing, and the interpreting of LADO. Not my colleagues here tonight. Attitudes and ideology are also very centrally important from my view. As again, when there's a lack of expertise in a process, misleading folk notions come strongly into play. And the stakeholders, the judges, the lawyers, the bureaucrats, and the staff in the LADO agency use and fall victim to these language ideologies and folk beliefs. And so it helps to determine outcomes. If helps is the right word. This is especially true or damaging where we have languages in which folk notions overwhelmingly dominate the public debate
the perception and the layperson's view of a language. And of course, Arabic is one of those languages, as is English. Not all languages are in that situation. The fourth is procedure. The procedures within which LADO is used. Many flaws. I write 40-page expert reports almost every month detailing flaws. I'll just give you one example. The Home Office passes almost no information to the LADO testing agencies about the person that is being tested. They believe in a tabula rasa approach. So the testers are not told if, for example, a Syrian claimant says, well, I spent 10 years of my childhood living in Egypt, as I did in Jamaica. Or if they say, I lived all my life in a remote Syrian village, or any other simple or complex life history, not passed on. So the testing agency cannot consider and evaluate this information in their test. And here's some evidence. I'll give you a second to look at the letter. It's a few years old, but the same approach predominates. Okay. How are asylum seekers selected for LADO? Well, it's partly a matter of political expediency. And I can say that because the manual for doing this within the Home Office says there's targeted testing by nationality, which requires an exemption from the Equalities Act, formerly the Race Relations Act. For example, in 2013, exemptions were achieved for Syria, Palestine, and Kuwait a few years earlier, for Somalia, Afghanistan, Eritrea, always the countries from which very large numbers of asylum applications come and which are seen to be problematic. Otherwise, the Home Office decides based on strong suspicion, lack of documentation, lack of knowledge regarding the nationality they claim, and they say there are specific reasons to suspect the claimant has provided false information regarding their origin. But these specific regions include linguistic judgments made before language expertise is brought into the picture. How does that work? Well, the reasons are if a claimant seems unable to speak the primary language expected, or if their dialect or accent is inconsistent with the claimed country. So these are clearly based on Home Office oh, that can't be right. 5 minutes? Okay, I'll speak faster. Clearly based on expectations that are made without an expert basis for judgment. Probably they're most often dependent on interpreters and or caseworkers' knowledge and experience for these judgments. So a few issues that I'll move through fairly quickly, and then I'll come back to the ideologies. Arabic, vernacular Arabic, of course, is spoken by large populations in very many countries, one of the world's most widely spoken languages. So the language and dialect contact profile of its speakers everywhere is going to be different from so-called endogenous languages, languages spoken in just one or two countries and much less known. Okay? Secondly, public and media attention and stereotypes about Arabic, and until recently, much of the research are focused on standard and or classical and or international varieties of Arabic, which almost nobody natively speaks, rather than on the vernacular dialects that are actually the only possible useful subject for LADO. Okay? For linguists, language socialization and acquisition takes place in the family, in particular communities. Of course, there are now many excellent studies of vernacular dialects. So what's needed for LADO is recent research, because the asylum seekers didn't leave 30 years or 50 years ago from their home country, that's grounded in very specific places. Okay. The third issue is that knowledge of vernacular Arabic is actually considerable, up to date, and both wide and deep now. We have very many studies, very much detailed knowledge about how Arabic is spoken compared to some of the languages I've already mentioned. For example, Somali, Bajuni, Tigrinya, and so on. So LADO can potentially be done validly in this situation, but the existence of that knowledge also raises the bar for adequacy, and unrealistic hypotheses and poor analyses are less excusable in the face of all that knowledge. And the last issue is because of the special status of the high prestige varieties of Arabic. Arabic speakers, like English speakers, in a different way, carry very powerful ideologies and folk beliefs, powerful enough to obscure or confuse discussion. And since language ideologies in general are supported by mass media and schools, these ideologies about Arabic are communicated to non-Arabic speakers, and they influence powerful actors in the asylum process. These issues are well known to Arabic linguistic experts, but we have to expect that lay people, which is everybody but the linguists, lay people in the asylum and immigration systems will have basically zero understanding of these issues in almost every case. That is to say, the powerful actors are likely to be linguistically ignorant about Arabic and, of course, understandably about linguistics. Unfortunately, this is also often true of the analysts and even the so-called linguists employed by many governments or firms to conduct LADO. It's not true for all of them, but as it shouldn't be true for any of them, it's a dangerous situation. So, nationalist ideology, national boundaries should match linguistic ones. That's the guiding idea in the early era of LADO. And the consequence of this is that speakers of a dialect who, for example, try to speak prestigiously, let's say Harani speakers from the south of Syria, Harani dialects also being spoken in Jordan, might add features of Damascus from the mass media. They may end up sounding inauthentic. Standard language ideology, there's only one correct way to speak. By the way, these ideologies are false, health warning. So any other way of speaking is suspect. So language change, ongoing changes, dialect variation, contact between varieties are all non-standard, so corrupt, and so suspect in this process. But any normal speaker will show dialect variation, language change, or contact if they're exposed to it. Again, speakers showing these are often accused of faking their speech. And the last ideology is nativeness, that we all have one mother tongue which we learned from birth, used in our family, know best, and use most often. And this is an indelible marker of our origins and citizenship and cannot be lost. Of course, that's not true either. So multilingual speakers, probably many of you in the room are in that category, you're problematic for this process, especially those who learned more than one language natively. Also people whose first language is not their best one anymore, or most used, if it ever was. And people who have significantly or completely lost their first languages are especially suspect. Lay people simply don't believe that this happens. But there's a whole subfield called language attrition which studies it. So I am actually coming to the end. Back to the most significant moment in LADO in the UK, when the Home Office commissions an analysis for an asylum seeker. Remember, this step is based on these linguistic judgments according to these criteria. So we can now see that the Home Office decision is often going to be based on language ideology and stereotypes, at least in large part, and possibly buttressed by dodgy sources, such as the ones I didn't mention earlier, the CIA, private travel agencies, Wikipedia, all cited in refusal letters I've seen. And that at the second step, when the language firms actually conduct tests, they also lack adequately trained linguists or analysts. In over 100 reports I've filed to the tribunal, I've never seen one from the companies Sprachcover or Verified that the Home Office uses, in which the supervising linguist claimed to even understand Arabic, much less have expert knowledge of it. These same linguists often have only undergraduate training in linguistics, or at best an MA in, say, Scandinavian languages, never in dialectology or sociolinguistics. They depend on analysts who speak Arabic, but very often, at least half the time in my case files, not the right dialect for the person they're analyzing. So they have no native knowledge. And these analysts never have academic training in linguistics in all of my cases. Apologies to my colleagues in Switzerland and the Netherlands where that is not true. So, the last slide. How much confidence should we have in LADO analyses or outcomes commissioned by the Home Office, but lacking linguistic expertise and influenced by language ideology at that stage? performed by for-profit Swedish firms, but lacking linguistic expertise and influenced by language ideology, interpreted by Home Office caseworkers in making decisions, you guessed it, and relied upon by immigration judges in reviewing appeals. So I leave that question for my colleagues and for you to expand on. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So that was an overview of how LADO works in the UK, and what we're seeking to answer really is whether it works. And so Peter's answer, I guess, is that it could work if it were improved, and Peter actually has been quite modest in not speaking so much about his great efforts in trying to improve the standards, and also reviewing the cases, and also with regards to the Supreme Court. Was it the High Court or the Supreme Court? It was the Supreme Court ordered a review of how this linguistic evidence is used, and that review hasn't taken place. So that's part of the idea of improving standards, is to follow up on the idea of review, which and Peter has been campaigning for that. So next I'd ask Mohammed to please give his presentation.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Peter. You just made my life much easier because I don't have to go through like the definition of LADO and everything. So from the title of this presentation, as it suggests, LADO as a gate speaker, asylum seekers' voices. So mainly, actually one of my friends last year asked me, so tell me about LADO, tell me like what it is, what's your main finding? And I said, like, the conclusion is that the Home Office is using LADO as one brick to build Fortress UK. And yeah, she said, like, typical Mohammed, all the time criticizing the Home Office. But actually, this is based on facts, on statistics, and on the whole process of LADO. So I will mainly talk about the asylum seekers' voices, the ones that I interviewed who have undergone LADO, and their linguistic experience, but also their, let's say, like psychological and psycholinguistic experience with LADO. So again, as Peter said, it's used by immigration departments in different countries, including the United Kingdom, to assist in identifying an asylum seeker's place of origin or nationality. That's mainly when asylum seekers lack IDs, or when these IDs are questionable and they have suspicion about them. Well, with the high number of displaced people around the world now, like, in June 2019, the UNHCR said it's around now almost 71 million people are displaced, and whether they're refugees, asylum seekers, or internally displaced people. So that makes the demand for LADO even more pressing. Now let's look briefly at the process of LADO. So the UK is a signatory of Geneva Convention 1951, which recognizes the rights of refugees, as almost like 140 other states that have signed for this, and it was mainly after the Second World War to protect the rights of refugees. So usually when people come to apply for asylum, so the first thing is that they go through a screening interview, and that's mainly when their biometrics are taken, and they interview them, asking them mainly about the main reason why they are applying for asylum. After that, so they go, if they have any suspicions about them, they go through the language analysis, and that is before the main asylum interview, which is very, like, there are lots of problems here, and also the time that it takes sometimes between the screening interview and the language analysis could actually reach 2 years. And we know that actually in that process, especially if people are not in contact with their with their home dialect or language, then actually some attrition could take place as early as 2 or 3 years. So LADO, however, is it applied to everyone? No. It is actually approximately only 5% of the people who claim asylum go through LADO, and they are asked to do the language analysis. So let's look at the top 10 nationalities for people claiming asylum in the UK. So this is the first quarter of 2018 and the first quarter of 2019. So we can see like Iran, Iraq, Albania, Eritrea, and Pakistan are the top 5 nationalities that apply for asylum. If you look here, there isn't Syria, there isn't Kuwait, and there isn't Palestine. Okay, so logically speaking, if people have to go through LADO, it means it must be one of these top 10 nationalities, because the number of people applying for asylum are more than other nationalities. However, this is not the case, because people coming from certain nationalities are more likely to be tested, as Peter said. But if we look, this is a new kind of like journalistic research project that I was involved with The Guardian. And we asked for a freedom of information request about the top 5 nationalities receiving language tests between 2011 and 2018. If we look, the number of the Syrian applicants are actually between 2011 and 18, it's around like 10,255 Syrian applicants. And the number of people who did the LADO are actually around 4,000 people, so that makes them around 40% of the Syrian applicants for asylum go through LADO. So this actually, again, raised a lot of questions about why is it this way. And again, like Syria, Kuwait, and Palestine are one of the top 5 nationalities receiving language tests, but they are not part of the top 10 nationalities that I've just mentioned. Now, what are the reactions? So we asked like some people who did LADO and about their reactions, about why they think that, are they targeted? Do they think that this is random? So again, like this is part of the asylum seekers' voices. So Ahmed, who is actually one of my friends, so he's from Syria, he's 28, and he said, I've got nothing to hide. I'm Syrian, both my parents are Syrian, and I couldn't go back to Syria because the situation is horrendous. But this did feel discriminatory. Ahmed is a dentist now in the UK, so he came here on a student visa. He was in Dubai. He received a student visa to come to the UK. That means his passport and his identity, his qualifications were already identified and recognized by the embassy there, and then he had to do LADO. The same with Zahra, who actually also received a Chevening Scholarship, which is very interesting because Chevening Scholarship is actually from the Foreign Office, which is basically the government gave her the scholarship, and then she came here after she studied her master's. She applied for asylum, and then again they asked her to do LADO. Now, when the Home Office was asked why they're doing this, of course, the answer was typical. Language analysis testing is just one piece of evidence used as part of the consideration process to ensure genuine refugees receive our support. It can provide a speedy resolution to claims by helping to confirm an asylum applicant's place of origin, and its use in immigration cases has been supported by the courts, including the Supreme Court. So they have not actually answered whether they are targeting specific nationalities or not. And especially when we ask them about like these people have already been, their IDs and documents have already been recognized by the Home Office, like in the embassies around the world. Now, who provides LADO in the UK? Again, it is mainly Verified AB, which is, again, Swedish company with Språk as well. How is LADO used as a gatekeeper? So it's mainly through employing non-expert linguists to carry out the analysis and also even the interviews. And we will look at how is that also affecting the interviews themselves. Now, this, so it was taken from Verified AB website, and this is mainly their main criteria about like, you know, how to employ language analysts. If we look at, so this is literally just taken 2 days ago from their website. If we look at the criteria, there isn't anything that mentions even a BA in linguistics or an MA. So it's mainly all what you need to do is like a native speaker of the language. But also that makes us question about, like, again, we come to the question of native speakers versus trained analysts. But how about if we can combine both of them? So now this raises an interesting question, because, like, you know, if we look at that, if we look at the criteria to hire people to do the analysis, that makes them, like, you know, not very aware of one of the main linguistic aspects that affect actually the whole process of LADO, which is authenticity. So what is authenticity? So authentic language can be considered language produced in authentic contexts by authentic speakers. And again, this is very problematic, because what counts as an authentic Syrian? Do we really have only one, for example, like standard Syrian dialect that stops literally on the borders of Syria, or does it go beyond the border? So again, like, who decides what a Syrian dialect is, and what qualifications do these people need to have in order to carry out, at least to some extent, an accurate analysis? And there is also the assumption of perfect monolingualism and homogeneity in standard national language. So, for example, the concept of Assyrian Arabic as a geographic variety is flawed. What I will show you here is the map of Syria. So if we look, at the map of Syria, Al-Barini, who's a sociolinguist, he wrote a book recently on the modern Arabic sociolinguistics, and he was mentioning that, for example, the dialect spoken in Deir ez-Zor, which is literally here, not far from Iraq, is actually closer to the dialect found in Iraq than those that are found in other cities in Syria. That, again, could be applied to Dara, which is, again, like, the Hurani dialect with Jordan, and it also applies, interestingly, to actually what we call Hatay province in Turkey, or Liwat Skandarun, which was annexed which is a Syrian land annexed by the Turkish in 1939, and the majority of the people there speak Arabic, similar, which is like their dialect is similar to the one found in the mountains of Latakia in Syria. So again, like, someone could actually come to the UK, like, not probably through smuggling, who actually already holds a Turkish nationality, for example. So they can come and they can claim to be Syrian, and they could speak the language. So it goes beyond the the national boundaries or the geographic boundaries. And again, there is a complete blockage of the life trajectory and also the language history of the claimants from the analysts. So the analysts do not have the required information that could make them carry out at least, or like to some extent, an accurate analysis. Because again, you need to look at where these people, whether there was any language contact or dialect contacts with other dialects, etc. And then there is the issue of language accommodation, and language accommodation is a well-researched area, and it mainly looks at people usually tend to converge their language in order to suit the one in front of them, especially when there is a power hierarchy. And that is what one of the linguists, Copeland, mentioned. It is to create the likeness between people. So sometimes, you tend just to use a dialect that could suit the other people, especially if you know how or like if you have been exposed to that one. And that makes also some that raises some questions about, for example, if you bring, for example, let's say a Jordanian or an Iraqi interviewer that interviews, for example, a Syrian claimant. In that case, if that person is actually or has been exposed to the dialects in Iraq or Jordan or Lebanon, anywhere else, then in that case they might subconsciously or consciously use that dialect, which makes it sound to the interviewer or to the analyst as inauthentic. Now, what are the asylum speakers' reactions about this? So, again, from the interviews that I did with asylum seekers and also with legal professionals, I've identified 4 main themes. So, the first one, language contact and change, and then practicing language for the test, and then the role of the analyst, and finally, feelings and attitudes towards LADO. Starting with this extract from Wael, who claimed to be from Syria, and he said, the interviewer said, we Syrians don't say g instead of k, which is q, as in the word al or qal, as in he said. So that is what it means here. You said gal. And this is nonsense, because what we first of all, it clearly shows that the person who said that statement does not have an understanding of the linguistic landscape in Syria and the variation in the dialects, because gal, it is actually used in a lot of places in eastern Syria near, again, Deir ez-Zor and Al-Bokamal. So it is not really very accurate. This is first of all. Second of all, even if this word is not really used, so how come that you decide that this person is not Syrian based on like 1 or 2 or even few words mentioned that are not typically perceived as the Syrian dialect? And I don't know what that exactly means. So yeah, again, so this is one of the reactions. The second one, practicing for the test. And Dania said, I know that some people usually memorize scenarios and practice on the would-be questions in the interview. So they go there and repeat these scenarios in front of the analyst. They watch Syrian TV series and practice the words that they want to use till they pronounce them correctly. And most of the people that I interviewed, they all said that actually around between 60 and 80% of the questions that are in the interview are already anticipated, and some of them, even the Syrian ones, the German one, practiced them because of the fear. So you can imagine that if someone probably who, I don't know, makes a lot of contact with Syrians, watch a lot of Syrian TV drama, which was known and very public to the Arab world, then in that case it could make their case stronger, and they could to some extent deceive the people in front of them, taking into account that these questions are already to some extent anticipated and they are rehearsed. But again, that also comes with the problems, which is the memorizing, and that could pose some questions about the authenticity and how people sound authentic to the interviewers. Now, the role of language analyst. So again, back to Wael, who said the interviewer said that. So Wael was annoyed, and then he said, he really provoked me, especially the way he was speaking to me. He was intimidating, and every few minutes he says, in an annoying way. Then I told him, please, can you stop me and answer? Then you do whatever you want, but please do not say, Then he stopped. So that shows you also the level of the unprofessional standards that are followed. First of all, how come that you tell the person in front of you that you're not Syrian or you don't sound Syrian? So this is almost like, jumping to conclusions before carrying out systematic and reliable analysis. And second of all, this sounds as if it is really an intimidating environment, threatening environment, which makes what is known as language anxiety. So people tend to be stressed, and then their use of that could block them from, let's say, participating in the interview fully. Feelings and attitudes towards LADO. So one of them, Khaled, said, I felt like a criminal in an interrogation session. And Dania said, I felt like a prisoner when I was talking in that closed room on the phone with someone who has a lot of power over my application and my fate. And other comments revolved around how the system is open to abuse and the need for having a face-to-face interview rather than a phone interview. And of course, there are some questions about security here that we're not going to discuss now. So does LADO work? Well, I do not think that it is actually working in its current form and practice, simply for one reason. We're not talking about people learning language here. We're not talking about a linguistic issue, a normal linguistic issue. We're talking about people's fates. It's a very high-stakes environment. People's lives could be completely changed because of this. So that is why it must be very reliable system, and it must be very accurate, and there must not be really 1% of any mistake, because again, we're talking about literally people's lives. So that's why I do not think it is working in its current form, and again, it's because we're not dealing with a normal case. But we need to deal with the reality, and that's why there must be massive changes, especially and most importantly to the Home Office policy. To be honest, I think there's a lot of a lot of academics and linguists who are pushing for change, and this is great. I think there is enough research that tells us how this could be improved, and of course more research needs to be done. But I believe that it is a political issue, it is a policy issue. And that is why I think there must be enough pressure on the Home Office and on the policy decision people in order to take linguists seriously, take all of these recommendations seriously and work on them. Because again, it is not really only technical linguistic issue. I think it is more political and policy issue. And that needs definitely to be changed. But some of the conclusions and recommendations, at least now, language analysts must be trained linguists. This is really basic. This is one of the most basic things, and Peter talked a lot about this, and I hope that this could change. Changing the forms of the questions and the questions themselves helps to avoid high percentage of prediction. This is fair for the asylum seekers, and it's also fair for the Home Office and for the whole system. Creating a non-threatening environment in the interview aids asylum seekers to participate fully in the interview, and employing the current qualified refugees to cover LADO demands, and especially if we're talking about situations like Syria or Iraq, there is almost more than 1 million Syrian refugees in Europe, and I'm sure all of them, some of them cover all the different linguistic landscape and language variation in Syria, so they could use the skills and of these people, especially if they hold qualifications in linguistics. But I do not think this is the case, because some of the analysts actually who have been in Europe for more than 10 or 15 years, and again we talk about the idea of attrition. So some people actually, they're not really fully aware of the language change that occurred in Syria or elsewhere. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Chris, please. So Chris and I actually studied Arabic together at SOAS quite a few years ago, so it's Good to have you here.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation, Nancy. Now, there were some technical issues before, which do not seem to me to have been resolved, so I'm going to resolve them now. Okay. So yes, I studied Arabic at SOAS. I now teach linguistics and Arabic at SOAS, and my job title is Senior Lecturer in Arabic Linguistics. And if you Google Arabic Linguistics, my name will probably be near the top. So, when solicitors who are acting for people who have been denied asylum search on Google for an expert in Arabic, they often find my name. And so, starting some years ago, I was contacted by solicitors asking me to provide a new expert's opinion on the speech of their client to try to contradict the negative assessment by these two Swedish companies which my colleagues have told you about. The main one now being called Verified. And we're going to hear that name a few times today. So that's how I started to get involved with this. And I have acted as an expert in several claims, several appeals, a fraction of the number that Peter has. But I've started to take also an academic research interest in this whole issue, and I've conducted research funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who I need to gratefully acknowledge their support here, together with my colleague Hanedi Ismail. And I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes towards the end of my talk telling you a little bit about that research. Okay, so in essence, what I want to do today is, my talk is arranged around these three questions in my title. Does LADO work? What I want to explore to start with is what are the main flaws, a lot of which have already been mentioned, but I can give you more in how LADO for Arabic is generally conducted in the UK. But I also want to consider quite an important practical question, namely, could it be argued nevertheless to do the job, albeit imperfectly? Now, Mohammed has expressed the opinion on this that no, it does not. And I don't really want to contradict him, but there are some complicated issues to consider here. Could it work better? Well, I think the answer to that is certainly yes. And one way, I have some ideas which I tested in my research, which I want to tell you about, which I think could make it more effective. And finally, I just want to raise some open questions around the general theme of, should we be trying to abolish LADO? Okay. So, we now know all of this. Various governments use LADO to try to help them decide asylum cases. Now, the dominant paradigm, which is all we've heard about today, involves recording whatever speech the applicant chooses to produce in an interview. And maybe they choose to reproduce a whole load of phrases that they've heard in soap operas, Syrian soap operas, or whatever. And then that speech gets analysed to see whether it has the features that the analysts expect it to have if the person is really from where they say they're from. So, there are two main problems with this general approach, and they point in different directions. There's the problem of false negatives and false positives. So, false positives, you do, as Mohammed pointed out, you do get fraudulent applicants, people who, for example, are not from Syria, but say they're from Syria and attempt to imitate a Syrian accent or Syrian speech in general. So these people who do exist, with this method of doing LADO, they have quite a lot of freedom to repeat prepared words or phrases from this variety which is not their own, but which they're trying to imitate. And then from the other point of view, which many might consider a more serious problem, the people doing the analyzing, because, as we've heard, their qualifications are very often inadequate, there's a very great risk that they come across features of the speech of a genuine claimant which they're unfamiliar with, and because they're unfamiliar with them, they assume these features mean the person is doing a bad job of imitating. But it could easily be the case that this is what real people from the exact location in question speak like, but the analyst is simply unfamiliar. Peter's mentioned briefly that outside of the UK there are one or two places, for example Switzerland, where they invest very heavily in LADO, spend a lot of money on each case, and mitigate these problems to arguably a considerable extent. So you have long interviews conducted by native speakers of some kind of Arabic, and we'll come back to that point, who are also expert linguists, typically with a PhD in linguistics, Arabic linguistics. But the UK is not like that, right? So what we have is brief interviews conducted by Verified, usually in the region of 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. And as we've heard, they're analysed by a combination of non-expert so-called native speakers and non-Arabic speaking so-called experts. Now, why do they have the native speakers with no linguistic training at all? It's not actually crazy, okay? So there has been research done which shows that native speakers of a particular variety of a language, a particular dialect of a language, do have special abilities beyond that of a non-native speaker, even if that non-native speaker is an expert, to pick up certain cues of native and non-native speech. But this is very important, that these cues are in what's called fine phonetic details, so fine details of accent. But of course there's much more to language than just how you pronounce it. There's the grammar and there's the vocabulary. And Verified's native speakers don't restrict their opinions to the fine detail of the accent. They also talk about other things. So lexicon, I apologize for the jargon, this is vocabulary if you're not familiar with this terminology. And a big problem is that these so-called native speakers, yes, they're native speakers of a variety of Arabic, but very rarely are they native speakers of the precise dialect of the region of origin of the claimant. So, for example, one report, a Verified report from 2014 that I came across, the claimant said they were from the far southwest of Syria. The analyst, the native speaker analyst, is from Aleppo, the far northwest, okay, and hasn't lived elsewhere in Syria. So, as Mohammed already told us, there's no sense in which there's some unified Syrian Arabic that is spoken throughout Syria right up to the border, and then it shifts As soon as you step over the border, you've then got Jordanian Arabic. It's not like that. The Arabic dialect spoken in southwestern Syria is far closer to the dialect spoken in northern Jordan than it is to the dialect spoken in the north. So here is another example, and the point is that their whole methodology rests on the supposed abilities of native speakers, but from their point of view, to be a native speaker, all you need to do is speak Arabic natively and be from somewhere in Syria, which isn't good enough. How am I doing for time, Nancy?
You have, you've got enough. Till 2:45.
Till 2:45. Okay, all right. So, like Peter, I've spoken to several of the people who are involved in the running and setting up of some of these companies like Verified, and they'll often, when you put these problems to them, they'll often make practical objections, which are quite reasonable. You know, it's not, from the point of view of this small operation in Stockholm, is it feasible for them to source a native speaker from the town that each person who they have to analyze comes from? No, that's not feasible. But their methodology depends on having native speakers. So to me, it's not an excuse. If your methodology is in practice unworkable, maybe you shouldn't be doing it. And there are many other problems with how LADO for Arabic is done in the UK at the moment. And I'll just highlight a few of them briefly. So, for example, small things which could greatly increase the verifiability of these analyses just aren't done. Like, you could, so they make claims. Here's a paragraph excerpted from a verified report. I won't go into the details, but here are two little chunks of speech that the asylum claimant is said by the report to have uttered. It would be incredibly simple for Verified to just give a time in the recording where we can find this, and so we can independently verify A, that this was said at all, and B, that it was pronounced in the way the report claims it was pronounced. But this has been put to them numerous times, and you often hear, oh yes, this is an excellent idea, and we're very receptive to feedback, and we will implement this. It hasn't been implemented so far. So this has been mentioned by Mohammed, so I think I don't need to mention it again. This is a very important point. There's been some research published on this, which has pointed out, and my experience accords with this 100%. In every single case, it seems, where Verified finds that a claimant is not from Syria, sorry for the typo, it finds instead that they're from Egypt. Right? So the suggestion is that no one from, I should have looked up okay, Egypt is a big country with a large population. To be fair, it does represent a large proportion of all Arabic speakers in the world. But Algeria, for example, has, anyone know? I don't know. 30 million, okay. So something, a good third of what Egypt has. But they never come up. So apparently Egypt has many people pretending to be Syrian, and no other country, Arab country, has any. This scarcely seems plausible. So of course, the reason why it's Egypt every time is because Verified has an Egyptian native speaker in their employ, and it's an economy of scale. Okay, they can't get someone in from every town and village in Syria, and they can't get someone in from every Arabic-speaking country in the world. But then, where does that leave their methodology? Now, I think I've made it very clear that I am not at all satisfied with how LADO for Arabic is generally done in the UK. But I do think it's important to mention that in the majority of cases where I have seen a verified report because the person is appealing against a rejection, I've actually agreed that the claimant is unconvincingly imitating a Syrian accent, okay, a Syrian dialect. And there's no independent verification of this, but various current and former members of Verified have assured me that the vast majority of their LADO reports uphold claims of Syrian origin. So I don't want to say that despite all the flaws, it is better than nothing, but I think we should carefully consider this point before we necessarily, for example, call to completely abolish the use of LADO. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Okay, so could we do LADO better than this? I think we could. So it seems to me that an ideal LADO test, what would it do? It would offer genuine claimants a means of providing credible linguistic evidence for their claim. At the same time, it would deny fraudulent claimants the same possibility. And I think the way to do this is to pose questions that, in an ideal world, all genuine applicants, and only these, can answer. Okay? Now, in the research that I conducted with Hanedi Ismail, what we have been testing is the idea that supplementing this traditional interview approach with what's called lexical elicitation can help us approach this ideal for Arabic, at least. I make no claims whatsoever about languages other than Arabic. So, what is lexical elicitation? Basically, you give the person you're testing a prompt, like this picture of a fork, okay? And you ask them to describe what they see, or name the object that they see, okay? And you give them a succession of these, okay? Do we have native speakers of Arabic in the audience? Could you put your hand up? Okay, so the question is, you can all name these things in your native dialect of Arabic. Can you be confident that you know how people from, today it's Syria, in the future it might be another Arab country that people are claiming asylum from, what people call these items in these countries? The way that we can select the meanings that are useful for distinguishing dialects of Arabic is based on this wonderful resource, which is a word atlas for Arabic dialects, produced by a couple of Arabic dialectologists from Germany. And so this is an example of one of their maps. This is for the meaning tire, like car tire or bike tire, okay? And where you have different colors, that's a different item is used. It's not pronounced differently, right? It's a completely different item. So, for example, in Syria, the basic, you see purple, the basic term is dulab, okay? In Libya, gomma from Italian, and so on. Okay? So, can speakers imitate an accent that is not their own? The answer to that is clearly yes, but you need to be very skilled to do it convincingly. You might think vocabulary from another dialect is the easiest aspect to imitate. You know, for anyone here who's a native speaker of British English, I'm sure there are many words of American English that you could confidently name that you don't have in your own variety. But our research shows that it's not true that vocabulary is easy to imitate where the meanings are medium frequency. Okay, so not very high frequency meanings like now or this. So if you know Arabic, words like now or this or very. If you're familiar with dialects, you could probably easily name a few how they say very in the Gulf, and how they say very in Egypt, and how they say very in the Levant. These words are therefore useless. But if you're talking about meanings like fork and turtle and carrots, it's quite different. And the point is, it's an empirical question. My hunch might be that people can't imitate. Your hunch might be, yeah, that I think they can. Well, we tested this with, I forget the exact number, it was in the region of 85 native speakers of Arabic resident in London. And I have no time to go into any detail, but what we found is that there's almost no overlap. So genuine Syrians in our test all cluster at the 80 to 100% range. And people imitating are all down here. Now, there was one Syrian who scored very low, and we must acknowledge this. And there were two non-Syrians who scored very high. And if you want to ask me about that afterwards, please do. But the general point is, this is actually very good at a population level at distinguishing between imitators and non-imitators. Okay. So I think that's something we should consider. And I just want to, this is my last slide. My final question is, should LADO be used at all? And as Peter pointed out, it was not developed by academic linguists, the whole idea of LADO. We didn't go to governments and say, guess what? Thanks to our amazing linguistic knowledge, we're able to figure out exactly where anyone comes from, because that's not true. That's not how it works. So, yes, there are big problems with how it's currently done. LADO organizations give the impression of much more certainty and scientific validity about their analyses than is actually warranted. So based on that, I want to ask questions like the following. And I'd be very interested to hear the opinions of my colleagues and of you in the audience. So first of all, as I said before, should linguists and others campaign for the total abandonment of LADO or just its improvement? And I think we should consider that from a scientific point of view and from an ethical, human point of view. And it's not clear to me that we'll get the same answer when we look at it from both points of view. So it's not certain what we do there. The next question is it possible in practice to develop a type of LADO that's effective, fair, and this is very crucial, also cheap enough to implement that governments will actually want to make use of it? This is an empirical question which I don't know the answer to. I don't know if we can get the answer to it. But I would love to know, does LADO as currently conducted result in a net increase or decrease in the number of genuine claimants being granted asylum? I think we should be wary of assuming that it necessarily means fewer genuine claimants are granted asylum. There's a risk of throwing babies out with bathwater here. A risk. I'm not saying I know the answer. And if it's at least possible that it results in a net increase, does that mean that we can therefore tolerate the minority, perhaps minority of cases where poor LADO leads to unfair refusals? Maybe we can't tolerate even one case where someone is unfairly refused, even if it means that a lot of other genuine claimants miss out on a way of showing that their claim is genuine. So, yeah, those are the questions I think we should be thinking about, and I'm done.
Thank you, Chris. So I've reserved a bit of time now for the speakers to discuss these issues amongst themselves, but first I'd like to say about how this event was set up. I did also invite other LADO experts who are in the UK. So Yaron Matras, that Chris quoted, I invited him. He didn't answer. Then there's Sebastian Rassinger,